I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is an active motor pool, not a tour stop for family members. The voice was loud, laced with an easy authority that came from a man used to being obeyed without question. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood with his hands on his hips, his starched Army combat uniform looking crisp even in the oppressive summer heat of Fort Sheridan. The air smelled of diesel, hot metal, and stale coffee. Behind him, the rhythmic clank of a massive wrench on a lug nut paused. Then another as soldiers in grease-stained coveralls turned to watch the unfolding scene. The woman he addressed didn't move. She stood near the front bumper of a dusty Humvee, her rental car keys dangling from one finger. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark slacks, and a plain royal blue top that stood out against the drab olive and tan of the motor pool. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in a neat practical ponytail. She looked calm, her gaze steady, taking in the colonel, the soldiers, the rows of waiting vehicles. "I understand this is a restricted area, Colonel," she said, her voice even and untroubled. "I'm here to review the readiness reports for the 7th Logistics Battalion." Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. A few of the younger mechanics snickered along with him. "The readiness reports. Those are controlled documents. You can't just walk in here and ask for them. Who are you with? Did your husband just get assigned here?" Amy Harrington met his condescending smile without a flicker of emotion. She held up the laminated badge clipped to her slacks. It was a simple visitor's pass issued at the main gate. "My name is Amy Harrington. I have an appointment." Thorne glanced at the pass and waved a dismissive hand. "A visitor's pass doesn't get you access to my motor pool or my unit's operational data. I don't know who you spoke to at the gate, but they made a mistake." He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a confidential, patronizing tone. "Look, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. Why don't you head over to the Family Services building? They can help you get settled. Maybe point you toward the commissary." "I don't need the commissary, Colonel. I need the maintenance logs for vehicles 7L3 through 7L28, she replied, her tone still perfectly level. "Specifically, I need to see the parts requisition forms and the deadline reports from the past 90 days. The specificity of her request seemed to irritate Thorne more than anything else. His folksy condescension evaporated, replaced by a sharp institutional arrogance. This was his domain, and this civilian woman was questioning its order. "I'm not going to tell you again, This conversation is over. My soldiers have work to do." He turned to a young lieutenant who was hovering nearby, trying to look busy cleaning a set of gauges. "Jennings, escort Miss Harrington back to the visitor center. Make sure she finds her way." The lieutenant, barely out of his initial officer training, snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." He approached Amy cautiously. If you'll come with me." Amy didn't look at the lieutenant. Her eyes remained locked on Colonel Thorne. "Colonel, I'm advising you to check your official calendar. You were notified of a readiness inspection from the Joint Staff 2 weeks ago. My name is on that directive." Thorne's face was beginning to flush a deep angry red. The idea that this woman was claiming to be part of a Joint Staff inspection was to him utterly preposterous. Inspectors were always seasoned, grim-faced senior officers, usually men who carried themselves with an unmistakable military bearing, even in civilian clothes. They didn't look like this woman who could have been mistaken for a high school teacher or a real estate agent. "Are you accusing me of not reading my own briefing materials?" he boomed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the maintenance bay. "I know exactly who is scheduled for that inspection, and it isn't you. I think you've said quite enough." He motioned more forcefully to the lieutenant. "Jennings, get her out of here. Now." Lieutenant Jennings stepped closer, his expression a mixture of duty and discomfort. "Please, let's not make this difficult." Amy finally turned her head, giving the young officer a patient look. "Lieutenant, what's the first thing you do when you can't verify someone's authority?" The question caught him off guard. He stammered for a second. "I ask for identification." "All right," Amy said, her voice holding a new instructional quality. "Let's do that." She reached into her bag and produced a standard nondescript government ID card, one that didn't scream her status, but granted electronic access. She handed it to him. Jennings took the card and walked over to a ruggedized laptop on a steel cart. Colonel Thorne watched, his arms crossed, tapping an impatient boot on the greasy floor. The entire motor pool was now at a standstill. Every soldier was watching, some with amusement, others with a dawning sense of unease. This was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. The lieutenant swiped the card. The screen flashed a yellow box. Access denied. Level 4 clearance required. He tried again. Same result. He looked back at Amy. Then it is furious, Commander. Sir, it's not clearing. It says it requires a higher level reader. Of course it does. Thorne spat, snatching the card from the lieutenant's hand. He scrutinized it as if his gaze alone could reveal its secrets. Harrington Amy, it's probably a contractor badge for the new mess hall. He shoved the card back at her. This is worthless here. It's not worthless, Colonel. Your system isn't cleared for it, Amy stated simply. There's a card reader at the battalion headquarters that will work. I am not wasting another second of my time escorting you to S1 to scan a fake ID, Thorne declared. He was done. His authority had been challenged in front of his entire command, and he was going to put an end to it. You are now officially trespassing on a restricted military area. I am ordering you to leave this installation. If you refuse, Lieutenant Jennings will call the military police and you will be detained. Throughout the exchange, Amy's left hand had been resting on her thigh, her thumb and forefinger absently worrying a small heavy object in a pocket. Now, as Thorne issued his final threat, she pulled her hand out. In her palm lay a coin, a thick bronze medallion, its features worn smooth from years of handling. Thorne noticed the movement, his eyes narrowed. What's that? A souvenir from the Post Museum. Let me tell you something, lady. Flashing a little trinket doesn't make you a veteran, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to impersonate a federal official. Amy's fingers closed around the coin, her knuckles white. The smell of diesel and sweat suddenly faded, replaced by the ghost of ozone and cordite, the high-altitude chill of a helicopter cabin in the dead of night. She wasn't in a sunny Texas motor pool anymore. She was in the dark, cramped belly of a Black Hawk, the vibrations of the rotors rattling her teeth. The faces around her were smeared with camo paint, their eyes grim under the dim red light of the cabin. A hand, calloused and steady, had pressed this very coin into her palm, just as the ramp lowered into a storm of dust and rotor wash. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a marker. A debt paid. A silent acknowledgement from a world Colonel Thorne couldn't even imagine. She brought her focus back to the present. Her expression unreadable. Across the sprawling lot, half hidden behind the looming frame of a heavy expanded mobility tactical truck, Command Sergeant Major Davies had been watching the whole affair with a growing sense of dread. He was an old soldier with creases around his eyes that had been earned in places like Fallujah and the Karingal Valley. He'd been trying to diagnose a persistent engine knock when the colonel's shouting had drawn his attention. At first, he'd just seen Thorne berating some civilian, but something about the woman's posture, the way she stood her ground perfectly still, absorbing the colonel's fury without yielding. An inch pricked at his memory. He wiped grease from his hands with a red rag and squinted, trying to get a better look. Blonde hair, blue shirt. The name carried on the wind was faint. Harrington. It clicked. Not just a click, but a thunderclap in his mind. He'd known a Harrington, as sharp as attack Major Harrington, an intelligence officer seconded to his logistics unit in Afghanistan. The one who had rerouted their entire supply convoy in the middle of a complex ambush, calling in air support and navigating them through a sidewalk, all from a flickering laptop in a command vehicle. She'd saved half his company that day. He remembered her calm, precise voice on the radio, a beacon in the chaos. He crept closer, keeping a row of tires between him and the scene. He saw the coin in her hand. His blood ran cold. He knew that coin. He'd seen one just like it on the desk of a task force commander, a man who answered to no one below the president. Colonel Thorne was threatening to have her arrested. Davies's mind raced. He couldn't intervene directly. Thorne was a full colonel and the brigade commander. Going to him would be useless. He needed to go over his head. Way over. He fumbled for his personal cell phone, his thick, greasy fingers struggling with the screen. He scrolled through his contacts past dozens of names until he found the one he was looking for. Milligram Wallace Aid. He pressed the call button and ducked fully behind the truck, his heart pounding against his ribs. The phone picked up on the second ring. Captain Miller. Sir, this is Command Sergeant Major Davies with the 7th log. I'm in Colonel Thorne's motor pool. You're not going to believe this, sir. We have a situation. He spoke in a low, urgent whisper. The colonel is about to have a civilian woman arrested for trespassing. A civilian? The aide asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Sergeant Major. I'm sure the colonel can handle a civilian." "Sir, you don't understand." Davies cut in, his voice strained. "Her name is Harrington. Amy Harrington. I think it's her." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Her who?" "Sergeant Major. General Harrington." "Sir," Davies breathed. "The one from the Joint Staff. The one they call the Ghost." I think Thorne just threatened to arrest a one-star general. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. And in that silence, Davies knew the cavalry was on its way. Inside the sprawling air-conditioned headquarters of Fort Sheridan, Captain Miller stood frozen next to his desk, the phone still pressed to his ear. The words General Harrington and arrest were ricocheting in his brain. He burst into the office of his boss, Major General Wallace, without knocking. "Sir, I just got a call from CSM Davies in the 7th Logistics Motor Pool." General Wallace looked up from a stack of budget reports, his expression one of pure annoyance at the interruption. Wallace was a big man, a former armor officer who carried the weight of his 2 stars with a nonsense gravity. "What is it, Miller?" "Sir, Colonel Thorne is detaining a civilian woman while aside rubbing his temples, and this requires my personal attention. Let Thorne handle it. He's a brigade commander, for God's sake." Sir CSM Davies is certain the woman is Brigadier General Amy Harrington. The name hung in the air. Wallace's annoyance vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Are you sure?" "The Harrington from the J4 readiness team. She's not due to check in until 1400. "Davies is sure, sir. He served with her in Afghanistan. He said Thorne is accusing her of trespassing and is about to call the MPs." Wallace was already on his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and impending fury. He strode over to his computer terminal. Miller close behind. "Pull up the inbound distinguished visitor log for today." Now Miller's fingers flew across the keyboard. A file appeared on the screen. There it was. Harrington Amy L. Brigadier General, U.S. Army. Arrival 090000. Purpose: unannounced readiness assessment. 7th Logistics Brigade. Reporting directly to Joint Staff. Wallace stared at the screen, then at his captain. Unannounced. Thorne was supposed to get a potential visitor notice. Nothing specific. She was walking his lines before he even knew she was on post. He snatched his patrol cap from its peg on the wall. "Get my driver. Get my sergeant major. Tell them we are leaving right now. Move." Back in the sun-baked motor pool, Colonel Thorne had reached the end of his non-existent patience. The static hiss of a radio broke the tense silence as Lieutenant Jennings finally made the call. "Dispatch, this is Stallion 6. Actual. I need MP presence at Motor Pool 7. We have a civilian female refusing to depart a restricted area." Amy Harrington heard the call, but her expression didn't change. She simply looked at Thorne. "This is your last opportunity to de-escalate this situation, Colonel." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The only thing de-escalating here is you into the back of a patrol car. I've had it. I want her processed for trespassing, and I want her investigated for impersonating a federal official. That little coin of hers," he gestured at her closed fist, "is probably a cheap knockoff she bought online. Check her for fraudulent wear of military insignia." It was the final irrevocable insult. He wasn't just calling her a liar. He was calling her a fraud, a stolen valor case, the lowest form of life in the military ecosystem. The accusation hung in the thick, humid air, uglier than any profanity. The MPs were pulling up, their lights not yet flashing, but their presence adding another layer of official gravity to Thorne's disastrous overreach. And then another sound cut through the air. Not a police siren, but the distinct low-frequency whoop of command staff vehicles approaching at high speed. 2 black Suburbans and a polished staff car with a general officer's flag mounted on the fender screeched to a halt at the edge of the asphalt lot, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel. The doors flew open with practiced urgency. Major General Wallace emerged from the staff car, his face like a thundercloud. His own command sergeant major, a man who looked like he was carved from granite, was half a step behind him. They were flanked by a handful of other staff officers, including a female lieutenant colonel who was already taking notes on a tablet. The entire motor pool went rigid, tools clattered to the ground. The arriving MPs froze, unsure of what they were witnessing. Every soldier from the lowest private to Lieutenant Jennings, snapped to the position of attention. Every soldier except Colonel Thorne, who was staring, dumbfounded at the tour general, now striding across his motor pool with the focused intensity of a missile seeking a target. Wallace didn't even glance at Thorne. His eyes were locked on Amy. He marched directly to her, the gravel crunching under his boots, and stopped precisely 3 paces in front of her. His back went ramrod straight. He snapped his right hand to his brow in the sharpest, most respectful salute Amy had ever received. "General Harrington." Wallace's voice boomed, carrying across the now deathly silent lot. "Welcome to Fort Sheridan. I want to personally apologize for the unprofessional and utterly disgraceful reception you have received from a member of my command." The word general struck the crowd like a physical blow. A collective audible gasp went through the gathered soldiers. Colonel Thorne's face, which had been a mask of smug fury, seemed to crumble. The colour drained from it, leaving a pasty, sickly white. The MPs looked at each other in sheer panic. Lieutenant Jennings looked like he might faint. Wallace dropped his salute only after Amy returned a crisp, perfect one of her own. He then turned, not fully to Thorne, but to address the entire assembly, his voice resonating with cold, hard authority. "For the education of everyone present," he began, his gaze sweeping over the mechanics, the MPs, and finally landing on the petrified Colonel Thorne. "This is Brigadier General Amy Harrington. For those of you who don't recognize the name, she is the same Major Harrington who single-handedly planned and executed the coast supply chain reroute under direct enemy fire, saving the entirety of 3rd Battalion from being cut off. She is the same Lieutenant Colonel Harrington who served as the lead logistics planner for Operation Nightfall, ensuring every operator on that mission had the assets they needed when they needed them. She earned her Ranger tab when most of the men in this motor pool were still in grade school. She holds the Combat Action Badge, the Air Assault Wings, and the Bronze Star with a V for Valor." He paused, letting the weight of her accomplishments settle. "She is here today on my post at the direct request of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to conduct a surprise readiness assessment of our most critical units. And you, Colonel," he finally turned his full wrathful attention to Thorne, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "have just made her first impression of this command an unforgettable one." Thorne seemed to shrink inside his uniform. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. "You failed to follow basic verification procedures," Wallace continued, his voice cutting like glass. "You failed to show professional courtesy. You allowed your personal bias and your monumental ego to obstruct an official directive from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. You saw a woman in civilian clothes and you assumed she was a spouse. You assumed she was lost. You assumed she was a liar. You assumed anything and everything except the one thing you were paid to do. You failed to assume she was a soldier. Your performance today has been an embarrassment to your rank, to this command, and to the uniform you wear.